Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to learn how to do ink smooshing. There are two ways to do it. There's the traditional smooshing onto just a regular cardstock sheet, and then the other way is to use a stencil to create a shape that you then smoosh on. The supplies we need for this technique are transparency film, watercolor paper, and adhesive laminate. We're also going to need some white printer paper just to see what we're doing, and a bit of kitchen towel to help clean up. So what we do with the laminate sheet is we cut out a shape. This creates a stencil that you then can put onto some watercolor paper. We cut this stencil just a bit larger than the watercolor paper that we're going to be using. The watercolor paper we cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So you will see that I have 2 sheets of watercolor paper here. And then we have this sheet of film. We're also going to use water bottle filled with water and various ink colors. So what you do is you take your ink pad and then you smoosh it onto the film sheet, and then you spray it. Then what you do is put it onto your watercolor paper in whichever order suits you. If there's any excess that you don't want to use of the ink, you then use the paper towel and clean it off. Then you move on to the next color that you want to use. This technique is really fun and gives you a great watercolor look without having to actually do any painting. You can do this technique with any inks, including distress inks. The way it turns out might be a little different than mine, but because I'm using a water-based ink. I really enjoy doing this technique because it's kind of fun and therapeutic because there's no stress to it, and you can use basically everyday items. I'm going to go back over the stencil piece because I want to try to fill it up a little more so that the the shape that I cut out shows up a little better. I really like the lighter blue, so that's why I'm going over it more with the lighter blue. But for this technique, you can use whatever colors make you happy. And I'm just cleaning up a bit of the spots that where the water didn't necessarily get onto the watercolor paper, but it did get onto the stencil part. The details about the inks that I'm using for this technique will be found below the video in the description box. Now I'm going to use my heating tool to help dry this watercolor paper. You don't necessarily need to use it because you can wait for the watercolor paper to dry, but I'm a bit impatient and I want to show you the rest of the technique that I'm going to do with this piece. Once the piece is dry, you can then remove the stencil. The good thing about using a shelf liner for your stencil is that it's easy to remove. You can also reuse it. You can place it right back onto the piece you cut it from. Also, you're going to want to be a little gentle if something like this happens, which is that the pieces all got stuck together. If you're gentle with your stencil, then you can reuse it. Otherwise, you can always just cut another sheet out for your next project. Now we're going to use the butterflied piece and stamp on it. For that, we're going to use a stamping press. The reason we're going to use a stamping press is because I like to make sure that I get all of the sentiment onto my card piece. And sometimes when you use something like an acrylic block or a regular wood-mounted stamp, you might not be able to get all of that. But with a stamping press, you can stamp on it. You can use it as many times as you need to stamp until your sentiment looks the way you want it to. The stamp that we're using for today is the January stamp of the month from Close to My Heart. The January stamp of the month is called Everyday Magic. As you can see, the sentiment didn't stamp completely the first time around. That's because I'm using watercolor paper, and watercolor paper can be a bit bumpy. As you can see now, the sentiment is very readable. These are a few other cards that I made using this technique. I hope you have a great time trying this technique out and would love to see what you make with it. Have a good day. Bye.